Hey guys, this is Eddie here. Some of you may know me as a host over at the Action Figure Blues podcast, but since the world has decided to go all topsy-turvy, I figured I would give it a shot to doing this action figure review over in, I'm going to say YouTube, but video content, wherever I may end up chucking it up. So, crazy idea to try and become someone who talks about toys on YouTube when your name doesn't begin with Dan, but hey, I'm all for stepping up and breaking all types of rules. And I figured, what better place to start than really one of the first toy lines I ever remember collecting, and that is Ghostbusters. So we have the new Hasbro Plasma Series Ghostbuster figures. They've just come out. Let's take a closer look. So the main packaging of the box is a very collector-friendly windowed box with a design that looks like one of the Ghostbuster uniforms. The side of the box is a beautiful design that almost looks like it comes from Mondo Posters. The back of the box shows you the other figures that are available, as well as the Build-A-Figure. So first off, let's take a look at Peter Venkman. So Peter is a wonderful figure. He uses the base mold for the Ghostbusters. This is a buck that you're going to find across all four of the main characters. Now there is some slight change to the sculpting, which is hard to describe because it's not so much the sculpting itself, but rather the dimensions of the figure. But I'll get into that a little bit later on with some of the other characters. This is using Hasbro's new sort of facial printing tick to give us much more realistic Ghostbusters than we've ever got in the basic figure scale format before. It's a decent Bill Murray head sculpt, much more so front on and a couple of side angles. For me, weirdly, where it loses most of its Bill likeness is actually the back of the head. He generally has a bit more of a slope than this sort of more box shape that they've given to him. But he generally seems to be quite hard because, unfortunately, he is a fella who was losing his hair at the time and is quite thin, and thin hair is something really hard to convey in a sculpted action figure form. So here is Peter compared to the Mattel Classic series and the real Ghostbuster figure from Kenner. Now, I unfortunately didn't have the original Kenner figure as a kid. I had one of the Fright Action guys, but here you can get a better idea of how this figure compares to other basic releases. Next, we have the heart of the team, old buddy Dan Aykroyd, Ray Stantz. So Ray uses the same buck that Peter came on. He does have some slight differences though. Now he's got a little bit more of a bulge in his guts, don't we all? And he has a slightly different belt that has a hook to hold on to the goggles that this figure exclusively comes on. Now the facial printing is really good on Ray. But something about him stops him from having a great Dan Aykroyd head sculpt. I think Dan Aykroyd is another fella who's very hard to capture in this sculpted form. Weirdly, I think Diamond Select actually did it the best, even though their other characters not so much. I do think this is a fairly decent head sculpt when you have it on the right angle. It does definitely give across that Dan Aykroyd look, but from other angles, not so much. He almost looks more like Ricky from Trailer Park Boys. Once again, a little bit on the thinning hair side, does cause some challenges when sculpting a good facial likeness. So here is Ray when compared to his other figure counterparts. And you can see, particularly when compared to the Mattel Classics Ray, that it is definitely an improved head sculpt. Next, we have the brains of the team, Egon Spengler. So Egon also uses the basic buck, but his chest is slightly more elongated. Now the folds in the costume are the same across all these three figures. It's just kind of the shape of them, which leads me to believe that this is probably some digital sculpt work that's gone on, and some of the dimensions have been slightly changed to make these guys more unique. Now, when it comes to Egon's head sculpt, capturing that Harold Ramis look, this is probably the best out of the four figures. This really does read as Harold Ramis to me. They've done a wonderful job capturing it, particularly when compared to the Diamond Select or Mattel series. And I think the huge key to that is actually having sculpted on glasses rather than going with a separate piece that's then later attached, since he did have a very wiry frames. Now, there is a little bit of flesh tone in between where the rim of the glasses may meet the face. It's not perfect from profile angles, but when you're looking at him slightly slide on, glass generally does kind of bend light to make it look like there's that sort of little bit of a magnifying effect going on. So from certain angles, it does also help on the figure when you're looking inside the glasses to the sides. So it is both a bit of a con and a bit of a plus to adding a realism to this guy. So here is Egon with his other figure counterparts, particularly my well-worn Kenner figure. Egon was my favourite character as a kid, so that action figure definitely saw a lot of use. And last but certainly not least, we have Winston Zeddemore. Now, as far as I can tell, Winston has no changes to the buck. This is pretty much the exact same buck as the Peter Venkman figure. The only difference with Winston is his head sculpt, which is a very good Ernie Hudson. My only complaint with this one is his mustache is a little bit shiny, and he does have a cut in his hair where generally you would be able to see a bit of flesh tone underneath. This it's just coloured straight black. It's not too outrageous, but if there was just that little bit extra paint app in there, or even if you just left the black paint off, if it's the flesh tone underneath, it could add a little bit to the figure. So very small nitpicks there. And here is Winston with his other figure counterparts. So now we have the team, let's talk about the equipment. And what is a Ghostbuster without his handy dandy proton pack? Now, a lot of people, this is the big issue of the figure, is the proton packs and how hard the plastic is on them. And I'm going to circle back to this, but I have seen a lot of reviews stating that these proton packs are the exact same, and that is not the case. Now, the main clue you might be able to see looking here is the red dots on the nuclear turbine there are in different places in different figures. So on Peter, it's the top right, Ray, it's the bottom left, Winston's is the bottom right, and Egon's is the top left. And I mention this because you're going to want to put the right proton pack on the right figure. Now, like most modern action figure collectors, you might just buy a whole wave of these at once, rip them all open the moment you get them and just randomly assign proton packs, because you've heard they're all the same. But as I mentioned, they are all slightly different, and if you've got a misappropriated dot on your toy, you can also look at the factory numberings on the inside of the pack here. There's one on the black part of the pack and numbering on the green parts, and that's going to tell you which pack belongs to which character. Because, as I mentioned, even though the folds in the clothing may be sculpted the same, the shapes of the buck do differ depending on the characters, and you're going to want to get the right straps around the right character so you've got a fairly good fit. Now, there is still issues with having hard plastic straps, so the other reviews that have complained about this are still valid in their criticism, but it's definitely going to help you more if you have the right pack on the right Ghostbuster. And once you've got that sorted, you can get your boys set up and ready to bust some ghosts. These proton packs are probably the best we've seen on a basic action figure price line so far. My only real complaint is on the proton wand. You are missing that red cord at the top of the wand, which most other releases have managed to incorporate in. So after the boys, we have Dana Barrett, who is a fantastic character that I was always disappointed as a kid never went on to become a Ghostbuster herself. Now, Dana is a good figure. I'm not going to say great. Unfortunately, the folds in her clothes do stop her posability a bit. The colouring... it's hard to tell with shiny material like this what the color of the material versus what was shot on film is. It does seem to be a little bit more reddish than yellowish, but hey, that's always something that's going to be hard to guess. The Sigourney Weaver head sculpt is better than the Mattel release. However, I think NECA has spoiled us, unfortunately, when it comes to capturing the likeness of the fantastic Sigourney Weaver. Speaking of which, here is her with her action figure counterpart. And to round out the wave of figures individually packaged, although we still have one more to cover, we have Gozer the Destroyer. So Gozer was a nice surprise for me. She has a beautiful pearl colouring that's probably not going to come across in my images that I'm uploading here. Keep in mind, this is my first video. I am just using an iPad Pro, but she definitely has a beautiful pearl sheen to her colouring of the bodysuit, and some freaky eyes thanks to that Hasbro printing. And of course, she's got that wonderful Emperor Palpatine lightning powers effect to help your Ghostbuster figures die. Now, one thing I am happy to report to people who may be on the edge here is that Gozer does scale well with your Mattel figures. So if you're someone who collected the Mattel Classics line that unfortunately never got around to doing a Gozer, you would be able to pick up this figure, put her in your Mattel display, and it's going to blend in quite well without having to rebuy the whole team of Ghostbusters for yet another time. Lastly, in the first wave, we have the Build-A-Ghost, as they're calling it, which is the Terror Dog. Now, as much as I like to think of myself as a Ghostbuster fanboy, there are people who could run circles around me. Now, there are two Terror Dogs in the film. I believe that there are some differences in them, and that this one is Zool by the shape of kind of the horns on the heads, and a couple of other little shaping pieces. So it's technically if I am correct, the second Dana Barrett figure we get in this wave. Now, I might be quite wrong here. This could be Vin's, but it's a good add-on. If this was a figure that was released in its own packaging, it might be a little bit disappointing. It is lacking some articulation. There's a very weird silver sheen that sort of reminds me more like a cheap dinosaur toy that runs down the back. It's not good when you're looking at it front on, but I don't mind it as a profile effect. And here is the Terror Dog with some of his action figure counterparts. Now, I didn't cover everything with these toys, such as Peter coming with a ghost trap, Egon coming with a PKE beater, and I did slightly mention Ray's goggles, but this review is simply more for me to test out some of my video skills. You didn't necessarily need to know everything about these guys, hence why I didn't cover the articulation. I always find that stuff a little bit boring in videos. You kind of have a rough idea in figures on how they are going to move, unless there's anything special in there. One thing I will mention though, because it is a bit of a disappointment, Winston is the only one that comes with a stream. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have the Mattel stream effects, I only have the one that came with the original basic Peter, but there is those 30th anniversary 2-packs that have some streams. You can actually plug those to the ends of these Hasbro ones. So there we have it, guys. This has been the Hasbro Plasma Series Ghostbuster figures. For old mate Jason over at the Transformers Weekly podcast, there's your Gozer protecting the remote. For some reason he asked for that. I figured I would throw it in. So thank you for joining me here as I take a look at one of my favourite action figure properties, Ghostbusters, and I am really excited to see what they do with this line moving forward. Once again, I have been Eddie. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Eddie@3429. And also you can find me over on the Action Figure Blues podcast, along with much more talented toy reviewers than myself. So thank you for joining me for this outing. If you are hearing this, it means that I have actually gone and made the video and released it. But I will see how I go. Let's see if I can't learn a little bit more. So if you have any feedback, definitely shoot me a message. Let me know, and enjoy the toy aisles. And remember, potato cakes are best served cold.